Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Before I get into today's video, I want to say what I usually say at the end of the video, which is, if you like the videos here on the Dan Heisman Chess YouTube channel, you can like them, you can subscribe. The best thing you can do is tell your chess friends about the channel. You know, you could write it down on a piece of paper, hand it out at your local chess club, whatever it takes. We won a couple awards here for best instructional videos, but we don't get a lot of views, and I really count on people like yourself to help me. All right, today we're going to talk about pattern recognition. A couple weeks ago, I made a video that proved to be very popular about don't just try to do easy tactics to solve them. You want to be able to recognize them. So today we're going to take that recognition idea and talk about not having to reinvent the wheel every time you play. When I get new students, I often ask them questions like, what openings are you playing? And, do you look up your openings after each game? I would say almost 90% don't look up their openings after each game to see what they could do better next time. And what that amounts to then is when they're playing the openings again and again, they keep reinventing the wheel. And it doesn't matter whether you're playing a fast game or a slow game. When I was a beginner, I got out MCO 10 and I would play speed games against my friends, and then I'd try to remember as many as possible and then look them up in MCO 10 to see what I should do next time I play a game like that, whether it's a slow game or a fast game. And I learned my openings really, really quickly that way by looking up all these openings in MCO 10. Now today we've got databases. We can see on the right here we've got the Lichess Master Database, we have the Lichess Regular Database, we have engines, we have all kinds of things to help you find better moves in the opening. So you really want to look them up afterwards, and it's a lot easier for people today to do that because most speed games are played on the internet, and the internet saves your games in a database, and you could just go back and say, show me my last 20 games that I played, my speed games this afternoon, and you can look up your openings. So let's give an example or two or three of that. Let's say you're learning the Roy Lopez, and you learn the Tabia, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. And you say, all right, I learned to play bishop to a4. But now you play a speed game, and your opponent plays d6, and you have no idea what to do. Just nothing, no idea. So maybe you play knight to c3 here. Okay, so let's take a look at the engine and the database. Right now we have the master database up, and we could see that 72% of the time the masters played d4, and we could also see up at the top here that d4 is the #1 move. So that should tell you, if you played knight c3, that next time maybe you should play d4. How bad is knight c3? Well, it's not bad at all. We can see it's the second best move at 1/10 of a pawn granularity. It doesn't even show a difference between d4 and knight c3. But if we look at the master database, only 1% of the masters played knight c3. It was only played 9 times out of 649, which means they really don't believe in that move as much. But if we go to the Lichess database, now knight c3 is played 7% of the time. So you can see it was played 1.9 million times, knight c3. So you can see that the amateurs really didn't know, and they played a very reasonable move, knight c3, which again isn't that bad. But they played it 7% of the time, and in the master database, if we go back to D6 here, to the master database, it's only played 1% of the time. So it's much more popular to play knight c3 at the amateur level because they don't as much know what to do. But next time you play this, my suggestion is you want to play d4. And you want to do this for every opening. You'd always want to get to a point and say, if I play a move that's not the best move and there's a move that's clearly better, then we should do it. Now here, knight c3, d4 isn't clearly better, it's only microscopically better. So knight c3, if you want to learn that line, you could. Notice on the knight c3 line, if we look at the next couple moves up here, I'll highlight them in green. Black plays bishop d7, and then white plays d4 anyway. So it really transposes in some of the lines. So it's not an independent line. Okay, let's do another one. Let's say you're learning e4 again and somebody plays, let's say they play Sicilian. and you say, oh, I play knight f3, and then they play d6, and you play bishop c4. That looks like a good move. There's a nice diagonal there. That's actually, I have a name for that. I call that the high school variation. They just say in the master database, modern variations. But I call that the high school attack. And again, you might say, well, that looks like a really good move. Well, I'll just keep playing bishop c4 when people do that. But if you look at the engine now, after the game, you can see that d4 to play the open Sicilian is the best move. It's also number one. The transpositional knight c3 is second. And bishop b5 check, which is called the Moscow variation, is third. That's in the engine. If we look in the master database, d4, the open Sicilians played 81% of the time. Bishop b5 check, the Moscow variations, played 12% of the time. c3, which is the sort of the delayed Alpen, is played 3% of the time. And bishop c4 is only played 1% of the time. So bishop c4 is not in the top 3 moves, and it's not in the top 4 most popular moves. But if we go to the Lichess database for amateurs, we click on that. Now we see bishop c4 jumps all the way up to 17%. Okay, but that means it's a very logical, reasonable looking move. It's just not quite as good as the other moves. So people who play that move might keep playing it, figuring it's okay. And as we see, 17% of the time, 18.99 million games were played with bishop c4 in the Lichess regular database. But it's almost never played at the master level. We see it's played 2,300 times out of 216,000 games, pretty much 1%. And we could see, did it do okay for white? It did okay, but you can also see that the engine says it's not in the top 3. Right now, d4 is number 1 at 0.3. If we play bishop c4, it says you've lost all of your advantages, white. If black plays perfectly now with knight f6, which is also the most common move, then white's advantage is basically 0. So you just don't want to keep doing that. If you keep playing moves like that, then you're reinventing the wheel. You know, you're trying to figure out what's a good move on your own when you've got an engine, you've got databases to tell you, you know, what do grandmasters play, what do computers think are the best moves. And you don't want to have to try to figure out yourself by trial and error. That trial and error has been going on for a couple hundred years. And these days, we don't even need the databases. The engines are so good that you could almost just turn on the engines and ask them what they would do. And a lot of times, that's why we have a lot of, you know, 11, 12, 13-year-old grandmasters, where if we go back to Bobby Fischer's time, it was unusual for him to become a grandmaster at 14 or 15. You know, but today people can sit at home and find good ideas and good moves with the help. They don't need to ask grandmasters anymore. They've got a 3600 level engine sitting there over their shoulder saying, you know, next time you do this, don't reinvent the wheel. So we've seen how you could do that with openings. You can also do that with tactical patterns. You can do that with endgames. All these things can be done. Let's do one. Let's do a couple of those. Let's set up a tactical pattern. Okay, so this is white to play. Let's turn off the engine for a second. So let's say you get to this position and you try to reinvent the wheel and you say, oh, look, I see a seed of tactical destruction. If you don't know what that is, I have a couple videos on seeds of tactical destruction. A seed of tactical destruction is something wrong with someone's position that tells you there might be a tactic. What's the seed of tactical destruction here? Well, LPDO, loose pieces drop off, according to Dr. John Nunn. That's the number 1 seed of tactical destruction. And the knight on e4 is loose. But it's not only loose, it's on an open file on the same file with the king. Aha! I have an earlier video on the geometry of chess tactics, and we could see if you have a knight on the same line with the king, maybe we could put a queen or a rook on that line and pin the knight to the king and see what would happen. So that means our candidate moves would be queen to e1, queen to e2, and rook to e1. Now, normally you're going to put the rook there first. Not always. I have a puzzle in my library where you put the queen there first. But that's unusual. Normally you would look at rook there first. And then black's going to try to save the knight. Well, he has lots of ways to try to save the knight. He could play f5 or d5 or queen to e7. Those are the primary ones. Well, But one of the things you notice if you've seen this before and you're not reinventing the wheel is it doesn't really matter what he does. No matter how he guards it, we can now attack the knight with the move d3. And even though the knight is guarded, we have an AWL, attack with something worth less. So first we'll attack with something more to pin it. And if he gets out of the pin with the queen, he's still pinned, but now he's pinned to the queen instead of the king. And now when we play d3, even if he guards it with a move like f5, we can win the knight for the pawn. That's a counting issue, counting tactic, pawn for knight. And we get the knight there. If he plays d5 right away, we can do the exact same thing. If he tries to throw a monkey wrench and hit our rook like that, we can AWL the bishop also, attack with something worth less. And now we've got pawns attacking bishops and knights, and one of them's got to fall. So this doesn't save him at all. Well, this is like figuring it out. But if I saw this in a game, I wouldn't really figure this out. I'd say, oh, I've seen this a million times. Let me double check and make sure it's true. Just because you've seen a pattern a million times doesn't mean you shouldn't double check it. If it's an opening move, maybe, the first move of the game, you would say you wouldn't double check it. But if it's something like this, you'd say, I think rook e1 followed by d3 is pretty much going to win the knight. You're not reinventing the wheel by figuring it all out. You just look at it and say, oh, I can pin it and then attack it with something worth less. And I should be able to win it. And then you go through the lines to analyze it to just make sure that what you remember works in this situation. Because just because you see a similar pattern to what you've studied, where you've studied tactics like this out of tactic sets like Giannatos's Everyone's First Chess Workbook or Bain's Chess Tactics for Students book, or even just go online to a chess.com or Elite Chess, tactics test set, then what you would do here is you'd say, oh, I recognize this pattern. Usually you do this, but does it work in this situation? And in this case, it does work in this situation. So you wouldn't really have to figure it all out to start with. You'd already know sort of what the answer is, and then you just double check and make sure it works. If you just do it right away and you have lots of time on your clock and then it turns out it doesn't work and you had something much better, then that's a really, really bad mistake the beginners make. They get all excited when they see something that they've seen like in a book or a pattern, and they do it right away without checking it. And then when it doesn't work, they go, oh, darn. And after the game, they said, oh, if you would change the move order, or if you would move the other piece over or whatever, that would have worked. But the way you did it didn't work. So you don't want to jump on these things. If you see a move that wins the game, as Albert and Lawrence said in their book, Chess Rules of Thumb, that's a critical move. And when you have a critical move, you should take time. A lot of people, when they see a move they think wins the game, they play it really fast to show everybody how smart they are. But actually, that's not a good idea. If you have lots of time in your clock and you have a move that wins the game, it makes sense to play it really slowly to make sure it really, really does win the game. Because if it doesn't, maybe there's a much better move on the board. And if it does win the game, then the game's going to be over. And the fact, let's say you have, 30 minutes left on your clock, and you see a move that you think wins the game, and you take 4 minutes instead of taking 4 seconds. Then you have 26 minutes left. Let's say that puts you up a queen or it's checkmate or whatever it is. The game is virtually over anyway. And at that point, finding, great tactics is not as necessary. And whether you have 30 minutes left or 26 doesn't matter that much. So playing fast and having 30 minutes left when you make that wonderful move instead of 26 doesn't buy you anything. They don't give you extra rating points. Nobody pats you on the back and says, congratulations for moving fast and finding that. Yeah, we want you to recognize things as quickly as you can, but playing them and recognizing them are completely different. Just because you recognize something doesn't mean you should play it fast. You still need to double and triple check it, analyze it, make sure it's right. So you want to do those things. It's very important for getting better to take your time on every move, but especially critical moves. And any move you think that might win the game is going to be a critical move. I tell people the story. I once saw 3 games I was watching on the internet, 3 amateur games in 1 week, where amateurs were playing, not masters, and all 3 of them thought they had mate in 1. None of the 3 actually were mate in 1. Two of the moves lost on the spot. They thought it was mate in 1, and they missed the bishop all the way on the other side of the board that could take their queen. And they lose the game immediately. And in all cases, they had tremendous amounts. Most of these games were 45-45 games in like a 45-45 league. and people would have 45 minutes left. Some of them had more than 45 minutes because they were playing so fast that they would play all their moves in 10 seconds, and by the time they blundered, they would have 57 minutes left on their clock with a 45-second increment, and yet they would still play these mate and ones really fast and blundered. 2 of the 3 lost right away, and the third guy wasn't mate and one. It turned out he was able to survive and keep playing, but he played the move that he thought was mate and one instantly, and it wasn't the best idea. So when you have these moves that win, there's no sense in doing it. All right, let's do something with an endgame. Let's create a new chapter here. Let's take a well-known endgame that maybe you could study and not reinvent the wheel. Let's take defending king and pawn against king. Let's clear the board, put a king on e3, pawn on e4, and a king on e5. Well, actually, let's put the king on c7. Let's make it black's move. Well, it doesn't really matter. Let's see. Yeah, it does matter whose move it is. So let's go here and make it black's move. We'll orient for black, create the chapter. All right, so this is black to play. If black's king were on e5, a lot of teachers teach you to move straight back. And I always tell people, that's sufficient, but it's not necessary. Actually, when the pawn's not on the 6th rank, you can go to any of these 3 squares. But if you can go to any of those 3 squares and still draw, it tells you that if you start with the king on c7, you're not losing because you could go to d6. And if king on e5 to d6 is a draw, then king on c7 to d6 has to be a draw because it reaches the exact same position. So let's do that. Let's turn off the database. Now after the game, you can go to the chess base. This is the lead chess table base, which tells you which moves draw and which moves lose. You can see there's 3 drawing moves here. King d6, king d7, king d8. But we're going to play king d6. Let's turn off the table base for a minute. And now white to play. You might say, oh, white should play king d4 and get the opposition. Well, that's not the opposition. It's only the opposition if you're in front of the pawn. If you're on the side of the pawn, then it really doesn't matter whose move it is. If you get to this position, if it's white to move, it's a draw. If it's black to move, it's a draw. Opposition doesn't mean anything here, so I don't call this opposition. Okay, so it doesn't matter whose move it is, but it turns out it's black's move. You want to follow the rule that says, don't let the king in front of the pawn. If you move your king back, then he will get the opposition and he will be winning. So the only drawing move here is to play king to e6. So you follow the rule, which you're learning, again, not to reinvent the wheel. You want to know these things. If you have to try to figure it out, it's a lot harder. King to e6. At some point, white's going to need to push the pawn. Now black has 4 legal moves. How many of them draw? The answer is 3 of them, as long as you don't let the white king in front of the pawn. So going back, straight back is sufficient, but it's not necessary. When I play these things, I tell my opponent, I understand this, I don't need to go straight back. King to f7, white tries to make progress. Now he's threatening to come in front of the pawn and win with tic-tac-toe. If you don't know what tic-tac-toe is, it's a rule that actually is more powerful than opposition because it's a exception to the opposition. You can watch my video, King and Pawn Against King, part 2, where I talk about that. But anyway, you don't want to let the king in front of the pawn. It would be a win. So you have to play king here, and now white plays d6. Now you have 4 moves again, but now 3 of them don't draw anymore. Now only 1 of them draws. So we need a new rule to cover this situation. And that rule, again, where I'm not reinventing the wheel, I just memorized it, is to go straight back. King to e8. If you go any other move, then you lose because you have the wrong tempos. A lot of coaches say after king d8, white plays king d6 with the opposition. I don't call this the opposition because it's the same thing that we just saw a couple moves ago where the king's not in front of the pawn and it didn't matter whose move it is. Just because now it matters whose move it is, we shouldn't change the name and call this the opposition. But most coaches do. I just happen to think that's inconsistent. But in any case, black has the wrong tempos now and white will win. White will simply, black will have to move out of the way, white will push, black will move out of the way, and white will win. So therefore, we can't go back diagonal. We have to go straight back. And now when he comes up, they say, oh, get the opposition and go in front of him. Well, again, I don't call that the opposition, but if you want to, you can. There's nothing terribly wrong. There's no official dictionary of chess that says, Dan's right, that's not the opposition, and the coaches are right, it is the opposition. It's just a question of what you want to call the opposition or not. I reserve the opposition for positions where the king's in front of the pawn and it matters whose move it is. These positions where the king's not in front of the pawn, just because on the 6th rank it matters and on all the other ranks it doesn't, I think it's a little inconsistent to call it that. I do have a whole video on this called What is the Opposition, which is on my YouTube channel as well. But for now, let's just say king here gets the right tempos for black. If white goes back, black will just repeat the position. White waits, and now again you have to go straight back. Whenever he tries to come up, you, quote, get the opposition. Again, he goes back, you go here, he goes here, you go straight back, he goes here. Finally, he says, oh, if I go back again, it'll be threefold repetition of position. It's not threefold repetition of moves, it's threefold repetition of position that makes the draw. Black goes here, and now white has this choice of draws. He can draw by lack of material with these moves, or he can draw by stalemate with that move. So most people will stalemate, say, well, at least I still have my pawn when the game is over. Okay, so today we talked about not reinventing the wheel. You don't want to reinvent the wheel in the opening. You want to look up your openings after each game and see where could I do better. You don't want to reinvent the wheel with tactics. You want to learn your basic patterns, and then when they occur, you want to double check them and triple check them, but you don't want to have to figure them out from scratch each time. Just because you can solve something and it's not that hard doesn't mean that recognizing isn't better. And the same thing happens with the end game. When we got to this king and pawn against king and I had to draw, I've studied this a million times. I teach this. I don't have to figure it out. I know what I need to do. I know how to follow the rules, and that's what you want to do. Okay, so hopefully today's video helped you. As I said at the start of the video, if you can, please tell your chess friends about my channel. Word of mouth is a great way to get things going. I've got some great videos here. There's over 380 videos covering almost every aspect of chess improvement, and I need your help in getting the word out there. I do it on Twitter. I do it here on YouTube. I do it on social media. I do it on Facebook, but you guys can tell people about it too. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your help. Bye.